ready to go here. This is we made it to the end of the semester. I think I didn't start on time every time, but I think I made it to class on time every time. And I appreciate you coming here today because I know it's a little bit of a weird day, right? It's kind of a class day snuck into the middle of exams, so I appreciate that. So I guess without further ado, I'll just dive right into our review here. And just let me, I know everybody, I'm preaching to the choir here as you guys are, I see all the faces or the stalwart attendants of the class. But we know that the last lectures today, the final exam, is actually this coming Thursday, 9 to 11. And just to remind you once again, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, that's the macro chapters. There's 2 problem sets. I'm going to leave those problem sets open until Sunday, so you can work on that. You don't have to, if you want to perfect them, get 100, whatever, that's fine. You have a little bit of time. One other thing, I didn't mention it. The exam is not going to be any longer than the typical exam, but you will have the whole time if you want it. So there shouldn't be much time pressure. I think I'll just throw it out there that the theme of the exam is really just macroeconomic theory and calculations. But I would also like to just make one final shameless pitch for an economics major if you haven't thought about it. Or even just the economics minor. You can get rolling on that without too much trouble. I think I kind of messed it up last time. Just to tell you what it is, the 3 things I would say about it is that it is a STEM type major. And evidence suggests that if you can do such a major, you should, right? That is to say, a major with a significant technical component. It's short. There's the 4 intro classes, I guess, 100, 200, 201, 221. There's the intermediate classes, 300, 301, and 321. Math 150 and 4 other courses. So I guess that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 courses. And so it's not a huge major. For example, accounting is, I think, almost twice that, right, in terms of its credit requirements. And it's also a good, it dovetails nicely with comp sci, majors like that, where there is some overlap too with, for example, I think you have to take calculus in 213, stat 213 for comp sci. Those can be used for economics as well. Anyways, that's enough of that. I know you're here for one reason and one reason only, and that is for the review here. So I'm just going to dive right in. I'll do the questions that were on the practice final that I handed out, and then we will dig into the online questions as well. So here was kind of our big piece of theory, right? Which once again, it's really neat how far you can get with just this diagram. We have the short run aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves intersecting. Here at the vertical long run aggregate supply, once again, this is a vertical line because what we can do in principle over a long period of time is just dependent upon our technology and the people we have and things like that, right? Does not depend on what the price level is. Anyways. So I say draw a new curve that would show the economy in a recessionary gap of 500 caused by a fall in aggregate demand. So what I had in mind was that you would shift aggregate demand back and it would kind of go like this. It would cross right there. And, maybe for posterity's sake, I'll just draw it up on the board here. A little wild here. Those wheels it's like a bad shopping cart. Right, so what I had in mind is you would just kind of take your here's long run, I'll just call it P and Q, even though we know that GDP might be better. We start at a point like this. Here's aggregate demand. Here's aggregate supply. And what I wanted you to do was shift this back kind of like that, so that this point here on the above is 60 and 1500, right? And then the 2000 here, this gap is 500, right? The GDP gap. So, okay. Maybe if I wheel it like that for the time being, it'll show up a little better. So that was the first question. Now we have a table here from a mythical country, right? There are only two goods, hemp and mangoes. Sounds like a little slice of heaven there, right? Anyways, in the following questions, we take 2000 to be the base year, and we just have to do some GDP calculations. So real GDP using 2000, in the year 2000, well, all you do is take the quantities and multiply them by the prices and add here. So that would be 10 times 1, 10, plus 10 times 1, so this answer would be 20, right? Just the total value there. Now, of course, one thing that's kind of tricky about this exam is, I'm trying to hew pretty closely to this idea that I don't want, you to have to use a calculator. So when I ask these sorts of questions, I'm going to try to keep them simple like this. So nominal GDP in 2002, so you should know that nominal GDP is, you basically make no attempt to control for price changes over time, right? So you just kind of use current quantities and prices. So this would be 14 times 2 plus 14 times 2. 28 plus 28 is 56, right? So we have that, maybe I'll write it over here. Number 2 is 20. Number 3 is 56. And I'm sort of passing my own test here that these should be calculations. If you know what you're doing, they should be pretty easy in your head here. So now it's real GDP in 2001. Well, let's see here. To get real GDP, what we want to do is we want to use the base year prices, right? And let the quantities change over time, right? So we're told that the base year is 2000. The quantities in 2001 are 12 and 10. So we would go 12 times 1 is 12, plus 10 times 1 is 10. So that would give us real GDP in 2001 is 22, right? No prices have changed, the quantities have changed, and so we've had some, that looks good. Oh, and then I even asked, what is the growth rate in real GDP? Okay, so real GDP growth is something we care about. Well, usually what you do for any growth rate is it's kind of y2 minus y1 divided by y1, where y is just some generic value. So year 2, year 1 minus year 1, those values. In this case, 22 was what we had for year 2, minus 20 was what we started at, and then we divide by 20, right? So if my math is correct, this is 2 over 20, right? 1/10, or 10%, right, if you prefer. So there's 10% growth between the 2 years. And once again, I don't know if they're always going to be nice and neat like that. It's kind of like too much of a giveaway, but I'll try to keep it so at least you can get to the 2 over 20, 1 over 10 phase. And you know what? I should mental note to self on the actual exam. Maybe I should say, you know what? A fraction is okay. Growth. That's kind of weird though, right? The growth rate was 1/10. Right. Maybe a fraction is not okay. I'll pass judgment on that. I'll think about that and let you know. Okay, so here now we have a consumer price index, and we're talking about its behavior over time. And the first question here, number 6, is kind of just a toss of, I mean, should be free points. What is the base year in the above data? Well, it's usually the year where the CPI is equal to 100, right? That's how you spot a base year. I mean, it might be a little, sometimes it's more nuanced because sometimes, the base year isn't exactly 100 or it spans multiple years, but in this case, you can just kind of look and see there. Now I ask, what is the inflation rate between 2001 and 2002? Okay. Well, all you really want to do is think about what the growth rate in prices is over that time, right? Or the price index, I should say, over time. So all we have to do is, let's see, 2001 and 2002. In year 2, it's 140. In year 1, it was 115. And then divide by the year 1 value. If I'm not entirely mistaken, this is 25 over 115. Let's see how far I can get in my head here. That should be 5 over 23. Is that right? And then, oh crap, we're going to have to use a calculator. Is anybody 25 over 115?
21.
20.21?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was going to, of course I was. I was going to guess that it was about this, because if it was 5 over 20, it would be 0.2, right? And if it was 5 over 25, it would be it would be 0.2 if it was 5 over 25. It would be 0.25 if it was 5 over 20. So that's, you know what, I'll have to be a bit more careful about how those work out, but on the actual exam. But maybe if you have an accounting style calculator, you could bring it. Okay. What amount in 2002 would be equivalent to $20 in 1999? Yes, do you have a question?
There's a similar question on the online exam. 2009, 72.6, 2010, 82.4. So it's 82.4 minus 72.6, and then that's divided by 72.6, right?
Yes, and it turns out weird on the online exam.
Huh?
On the online one?
Yeah, that comes out to a different answer.
There's a fascinating answer to this mystery that I'll get to when we get there.
Okay.
But please bring it up again if I forget. I don't know if it's that fascinating, but there is an answer to the mystery, actually. Okay, so this is, let's look at this next one. What amount in 2002 would be equivalent to $20 in 1999? Now, like a lot of things, I think I made this more confusing than it had to be. It's really just sort of thinking about, kind of using your indices and multiplying a little bit. So $20 in 1999, let's see. What you want to do is take 20. Now, take what the value of the index is in 2002. We want to multiply it by 140 then, divided by the index in 1999, which is 80, right? So 20 times 140 over 80 is, well, let's see, 20 times 14 is 280 divided by 8. 35. Is that right? Okay. So $20 in 1999 here in this example is 35, and it's the same as $35 in 2002. All right. So I have to be very careful about how these numbers work out, so that you don't have to lean heavily on calculators. So I guess I'm sort of multiplication isn't all that tricky, is it? And division. So maybe I'm being a little bit too careful about this stuff. Okay, this is kind of the same problem in reverse, right? What amount in 2000 is equivalent to $28 in 2002? Okay, well, in this one you just sort of think about where you're starting and where you're ending. So let's say you have 28 you're trying to get to 2000, so the index has a value of 100 in 2000. In 2002 it was 140, so now you have 28 times 100 over 140, which I believe is, anybody? I think it's just 20, right?
Yeah.
Ten over 14 is, yeah, okay, yep. So, I mean, really the thing here to do is just realize that, you know, where you're going is the top number and where you've been is the bottom number, right? And that applies whether you're going forward or backward or whatever, if that makes any sense. Okay. The diagram below shows the aggregate demand and aggregate supply for an economy. The diagram shows, this is not, well, good writing here. AD, notice how the capitals are different, the capitalization's wrong, it's redundant, so I gotta be, you know, note to self. Okay, so we have the usual picture with aggregate demand and aggregate supply at the long run aggregate supply. As we've seen throughout the last couple of weeks, we think that aggregate demand and aggregate supply should sort of be pulled around the center of gravity, right? That is long run aggregate supply. So draw a new curve that shows the economy in an inflationary gap of 500 caused by a surge in aggregate demand. So really what we want to do is just shift out aggregate demand to get a gap between these two numbers of 500. So it looks like that should be shifting aggregate demand out to this point 140, 2,500. If I were to draw up the picture, might as well do so. And there we go. Here's long run aggregate supply. We have Q, we have P, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and we want to shift this out so that now we get the 140 and 2,500 here, like that, right? So then this gap is 500. Fair enough? Yeah?
That's how you want us to, probably to this comes up in the final, you want us to like answer just like that with everything.
You know what? If you just draw the new curve so that it intersects in the right place, that's sufficient,
I
right?
think what I got, I got the real GDP part accurate, it being 2,500, but the line I drew didn't really go through 140. So how would that work?
You probably want to make sure you get the intersection right there, you know? I think a person who handed in this, like they busted out their ID and just used it to draw nice sharp lines. That's good. Yes?
Would there be a question wanting to draw a new supply curve?
Oh, I guess there could be, yeah. Let's actually, you know what would such a question be like? I mean, I guess if I wanted you to draw a supply curve, I might do something, you know. Let's see. I might start the whole thing like this. So if this is the economy, right? So now we're in a recessionary gap, correct? Maybe demand had fallen for some reason, right? A crisis of confidence in investment markets, consumer confidence is down, something like that. What might you expect to happen now? Well, the natural thing would be for the economy, you know, people aren't working, because when we're at this point down here, we're below potential, so there's high unemployment. This would imply downward pressure on wages. When wages start falling, aggregate supply shifts out, right? So I might say something like, what would the natural adjustment process look like in this case? Shift the curve to get us back to potential, right? And that, I'm sort of thinking on my feet here, but that would be a neat question, because then I require you to sort of bring to the table your knowledge that it's aggregate supply that adjusts, right? in our conception, in our, of course, reality isn't that simple, but that's our organizing principle for thinking about what happens. So that would be a shift in the aggregate supply. Good question, right? And you heard it here first, right? So I don't know how many questions, there might be some on the online component like that, but you get a little practice of that. What kind of unemployment is macroeconomic policy most concerned with? Fill in a bubble. Yeah, so it is cyclical is the right answer. Fiscal I made up, and optional isn't really a thing either. Seasonal is a thing, but there isn't much you can do about that, unless as macroeconomic policymakers. Until our climate control gets better, seasonal unemployment is going to be with us. Frictional unemployment is important, as is structural unemployment, but we can't really do much about them, right? Frictional unemployment is people just, going through their lives, moving between jobs. Structural unemployment is just, I guess a necessary evil of technological progress, right? Like, we just don't need stagecoach drivers like we used to. So cyclical unemployment is people out of work just because things are bad, the economy isn't functioning as we would like it to. And so we can maybe do something about that. Well, look at this. So I draw this diagram kind of like the one I just drew over there. And I just ask you about the GDP gap. That's a little, at this point that's a little simple. Same kind of diagram here, right? 1,500 to 2,000, so the gap is 500. So in the above diagram, once again, we kind of just went over this. We would expect that the unemployment rate is greater than the natural rate of unemployment, right? When GDP is below potential, unemployment is greater than its natural rate.
I have a question.
Yes?
Is it okay if I, for number 12, put 500,000? Or is that...
Yes. You could do that, because I put I did put in real GDP in thousands there. I probably should just leave the unit. I think I just confused things by writing thousands. Maybe I'll just leave that off on the actual exam. So, okay, in the long run, what would one expect to happen in the above diagram without some sort of fiscal or monetary policy? Yeah, so this is kind of about, you don't actually draw the shift in aggregate supply, but that's kind of what I'm getting at, right? If we don't use any sort of policy, right, we would expect that supply would start adjusting, and that would be kind of this one here. Aggregate supply would shift out as wages adjust. I could have said as wages fall, right? Resulting in an equilibrium at a real GDP of 200 and a price level of 100. So is that right? That looks right. So you can kind of see, if I can bring this down so it's, what we're saying here is aggregate supply will shift out until we intersect at this point, which is 100, 2,000, right? I'm sorry?
13, question number 13.
What about it? What was the answer?
Yeah.
Oh, greater than. By the way, I looked at that. Maybe I hurried past it because I was a little embarrassed that I asked you to circle the best answer, but it sort of breaks across a line, so it's not clear how you would circle that. But that was the right answer, greater than, yeah. So, yeah, the best answer here is aggregate supply. And once again, I think it's, things are more complex than in reality, but I think this is kind of a reasonable taxonomy to start with when you're sitting there at a party and somebody asks you about the economy and you bust out the cocktail napkin and just start drawing. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but if it does, you can say, well, if the economy adjusted naturally, that's shifting aggregate supply. If we start using policy to fix the problem, that's shifting aggregate demand, right? So the aggregate demand shift might be if we used A, fiscal policy by increasing government spending, or if we use monetary policy, dropping interest rates, right? Lower interest rates, higher investment, aggregate demand shifts out, right? That would be kind of the way you think about these things. And of course, we even talked a little bit about how the outcomes are in some ways different, and that we get falling prices with the natural recovery. We don't have any falling prices, maybe increasing prices with the policy-based recovery. Yes?
Because the question says if the economy were to lift on itself, wouldn't AS be the only thing changing?
Yeah. Right, yeah. But that's an important, I mean, so oftentimes in the past, you usually have, I think this class has been pretty good about it, but you have people who have this overwhelming desire to shift both curves, you know. Well, aggregate supply does this, and then aggregate demand will do that, and I'm like, no, just keep it separate here. Even though the reality is probably more complex than I've made it out to be here. In the long run, what would one expect to happen if I had only scrolled down a little bit more, I would have, instead of starting to draw on the diagram already, I could have waited until I read this question. If appropriate fiscal and or monetary policy were used to close the gap, what would happen? Well, once again, you can think about the right answer here. AD, one of the ADs is going to change, right? So AD would shift out, resulting in an equilibrium at a GDP of 2,500 and a price level of 160. Well, usually you think about the policy as closing the gap and getting us back to potential. It would be hard to get to, you can't really get to that 160 point by shifting just aggregate demand. So it looks like the best answer would be aggregate demand would shift out. As prices adjust, that's wrong. 160 and 2,000 would be the best answer. So something a little funky about that. That would be the third bubble. Kind of like I described over there. Not in love with how that question went. See, it's like one of these, this is a byproduct of having to create a practice final almost a full week before you create an actual exam. There's going to be some bumps, right? The unemployment rate is defined as which of the following? Okay, so the key thing here is to think about how unemployment is just the labor force, right? Or, are the only group of people you're thinking about, and you're thinking about the fraction of labor force that is not working. So that would be the second bubble here. The number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. One thing I didn't mention is that one thing we think about a lot as economists is the labor force participation rate, which is the labor force divided by the working age population. In the United States, it's around usually 55 to 60%, something like that. But we really only talked about unemployed, how you calculate the unemployment rate. Yeah. Okay.
The labor force, it also includes the people who are unemployed, right?
Yes.
So instead of doing,
Ooh, that's a good exam trick. You could say there are X amount of people working and Y amount of people unemployed. What is the unemployment rate? And it's X divided by X plus Y, right? We have a question like that coming up. Anyway, I interrupted you. What were you?
yeah, that's what number 17 is. So, because at first I was doing like 120, and then and I was getting the answer wrong.
Yeah.
And I tried doing the 120 plus 10, and then doing the 10 over 130 times 100.
That's the right answer, right? Because you have to, so you have to, that is kind of the little example I gave you. You have to figure out what the labor force is, which is 120 plus 10, right? And so the unemployment rate is, in this setting, it's kind of a cruel trick, really, it's, I don't know how much I like that. It would be 10 over 120 plus 10, 10 over 130, which is 0.7.
It's going to be, the answer that I got is 7.69 or like 7.7.
7.7. That's just, I was about to say that. I'm kidding.
Well, for this one, since we had, would you prefer us to round up or leave it as it is?
I should be clear about the rounding convention, but once again, I have a way of kind of looking at all the answers, so I can kind of, if you wrote 7.715, I'm not going to, draw a giant red X through the answer, so I can check that. One time in class, I messed up a calculation on the board, and a student, said, "Professor, didn't you mean to write x equals 2?" I was thinking, boy, that's the nicest way I've ever been corrected. And yes, I did mean to write that. It was Okay, a little historical question here. During the Great Depression, which of the following best describes the behavior of unemployment and inflation in the United States? Well, if you look at one of the interesting things about the Depression was that it had high unemployment and at the same time prices were falling, right? There was deflation. And indeed, this was one of the phenomena that led Keynes to think about this as an aggregate demand problem, right? When you have, you think about what happens as you shift aggregate demand back here. You get low output and low prices, right? So he was saying the problem in the Great Depression seems to be one of aggregate demand, sagging aggregate demand. That's what happens when you shift demand back, quantities and prices go down. So kind of a historically important fact. Of course, in the 70s, we had kind of the high unemployment and high inflation, stagflation. That was puzzling or concerning to economists. Okay, so real GDP went from 1,000. $1,000 billion. I don't know if you'd write it the way I did, but you get the idea. It went from 1,000 to 1,050 over 1 year. And what was the growth rate? So this is the usual thing. What you do is you calculate it out. You would say 1,050 minus 1,000 divided by 1,000, which is 50 over 1,000, which even my feeble skills allow me to conclude that this is 5%, right? So, okay, 5% growth rate. Now we have the follow-on question. Using the rule of 70, we ask, how many years will it take for the economy to double? And really what I should have said is for real GDP to double at a growth rate of 5%. And so I like the rule of 70 because it really reveals to you 5% doesn't seem like a large increase in anything. But the rule of 70 says take 70, divide it by 5, you get 14. This suggests that growing at a 5% rate, something will double every 14 years about. That seems pretty quick, right? So you can imagine, what happens when you take your money and put it in a mutual fund that gives you on average a rate of return of 10%, right? That would be pretty good. But even that, so your money's doubling every 7 years, not too shabby, right? That's a good thing to keep in mind here. This question was a little bit harder than I would have liked because I didn't spend as much time, we didn't have the time to do the link between the money supply and interest rates. So I would probably leave that out, in retrospect. And I would just talk about interest rates in investment. But when you take Macro 201 or money in banking, you'll talk a lot about the relationship between money supply and interest rates and different sorts of money in the economy and credit and all that stuff. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, so if you increase the money supply, you can think about that as money is easy to get, just as a simple first approximation. Money's easy to come by. Banks will lend it to you at low interest rates, so a lot of money around, low interest rates. So money supply increases, interest rates should fall. And by interest rates, what we really mean is, something like the federal funds rate that the Fed controls goes down. All of the interest rates, there's a whole bunch of them across the economy, right? There's bond rates, there's the rate your credit card company charges you, there's mortgage rates, there's all of these things. But they all sort of follow suit, right? They all kind of move in the same direction. So interest rates go down, investment spending goes up, right? When interest rates are low. Now, someone pointed out to me after the lecture last time that I had said that I gave you a little rate of return on investment story, right? When interest rates are low, businesses are more likely to invest in projects, right? Because that beats saving the money at a low interest rate. But a student also pointed out that if you were borrowing money to start a project, right, you're also more likely to do that when interest rates are low. So that's another good way to think about it, right? So, you want to build I don't know if it's investing. Well, let's think about investing. You have a business and you want to build an extension on the side and hire some more employees. You go to the bank and say, I need a business loan. And they say, the interest rate is 10%. You're like, screw it, I'm not going to do it. If they say, all right, we'll charge you 3%, you say, oh, that's great. I'll borrow $1 million and I'll build out my business. And so that's another way of thinking about it. When, of course, the next link is that when investment goes up, so we have decrease, increase, when that happens, well, more investment spending is more aggregate demand. Remember, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G, as we conceptualized it. So that would mean a shift out in aggregate demand. And this indeed is a little question about how monetary policy works. Okay, let me segue immediately to the online exam. We'll see how we do with that, the practice. So when does exams actually, when do the exam period actually end? The 26th? Ah. I saw on my little music feed that on that day, I believe Electric Callboy is going to be making an appearance in Brooklyn. Any big Electric, no, Partycore fans? I guess my kids are right. Nobody likes that stuff. All right, so let me see here. Exam.
I wanted to ask you, if you
Is this question about Electric Callboy? No, I'm just kidding.
If you could, if it be possible for you to open up the fact of that had to.
Sure. Yeah. If you want to fire me an email and have me open it up, I can assign you a version. Of course, I might. The exam is a couple days away, so it's Thursday. So getting it done and all that stuff, there's not much of a window, but I'm happy to do that. Yeah, if you want to.
I mean, I didn't get to do this exam because I have like 4 hours.
I know it's that time. It's so. Okay, so let's just dive right in. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger. Okay, so question 1. Changing the level of government spending is an example of blank policy. Well, that's fiscal policy, right? Fiscal policy is government spending and taxation. So the correct answer was there, and most people got that right. Fiscal policy attempts to affect the level of overall spending by making changes in blank. This is the same question. Taxes and spending would be the right answer. And almost everybody got that right. Ooh, the money supply, though, kind of sucked a few people in, right? Remember, that is monetary policy, you would say. Changing the money supply and interest rates. So here's a little historical fact. When the Great Depression reached its trough in 1933, the unemployment rate was what? And it was close to 25%, right? And so that's the best answer. I don't know if I think the quantitative facts I don't know if I'll ask about on the exam, but the qualitative ones, I like that when you talk about, well, in the Great Depression, prices were falling and unemployment was up. That's a more important thing to think about. Yes, another question, I'm sorry. Yeah, did you have a question? No? Okay. A period of falling real GDP is a peak trough expansion. We'd usually think about that as a recession. I don't know how much I said about the formal definition of a recession, so I don't know if I'd ask you that, but it is, technically speaking, I believe, a period in which real GDP stays flat or goes down for more than 6 consecutive months. I think that's how we officially define a recession. Yeah?
So what I used to associate with the faculty exam is that falling equals recession.
Yep.
For the first track that you have to do.
I like that.
Falling equals recession, and then for the second one is rising equals like surge.
Yeah, rising is inflationary. Right, yeah. Price, good, yeah, that's good. if the economy grew at 3% this year and average prices increased blank, people would be better off this year than last year, right? So the idea here is, of course, that we want growth to outpace inflation. But one thing I don't love about this question is I should say if GDP per capita, right, nominal GDP per capita increased by 3% and average prices increased by something, people would be better off. So you would want prices to go up less fast than GDP. So the answer should be C. And okay, most people, nobody was really, a couple people, but most people weren't confused by that. During inflation, the blank price level blanks. Every time I say this, like where I read an answer and I say, during inflation, the blank price level blanks, it reminds me of a game show that we used to have called the Newlywed Game. Has anybody seen this show? So the premise was that what you would do is you'd take people who were just married and you would separate them, and then you would sort of ask them to fill in these blank questions, and you would see if they gave the same answer, right? So it would be like, on a Sunday afternoon in fall, your spouse likes to blank and would not like to be blanked, or something like that, right? And so you can imagine the hilarious, he might say he likes to watch football and interrupt it, and I don't know. So you can imagine the hilarity that might ensue. So, inflation, what we think about is changes in the average level of prices. So we're focusing on average in there. And it should be going up, right? Average price level should be increasing. So it should be B. And wow, very, very nicely done. These are pretty vanilla questions so far, right? No curveballs or anything. So real GDP is nominal GDP adjusted for changes in prices, right? So we're cruising along pretty nicely here. Oh, so it's interesting, real GDP. Let me just say a quick thing about this. Real GDP per capita would be adjusted for population, right? That's per capita, that's what it means. Double counting, it's actually, we didn't say much about this, but in macroeconomics 201, you'll learn a lot about GDP accounting and what sorts of things you can include in the goods and expenditures calculation. And there's some other interesting things that kind of come out of that. But yes, we do control for double counting in the way we calculate GDP, but that's not what real GDP is. It's about adjusting for price changes. In year one, an economy produces 100 golf balls that sell for $3 each and 75 pizzas that sell for $8 each. The next year, the economy produces 110 and 80. Okay, so I ask what nominal GDP in year one is, so there's a lot of information we don't really need for this calculation. But you probably know the deal, and in this particular case, I haven't made the numbers all that convenient, so we might have to use a calculator. But nominal GDP is just same year quantities times same year prices. So it would be 100 times 3 plus 75 times 8. I'm guessing this is going to be 300 plus 8 times 7 is 56, and then half of 8 is 4. So this is going to be 600. Is that right? Did I get that right? Somehow doesn't seem, it does? Okay, yeah, 900. So that would be the answer here. We'll see if I guess I can just look and see if my, okay, so, right, I gave a 45 dollar margin of error here. So it looks like 900 is right in the middle, so I got that right. And so did most of the people who did this question. Good work. So, okay, same exact premise here. Year one, 100 golf balls, and year two, 75 pizzas. Nominal GDP in year two, well, this is really progressing rather slowly. But we can see here that this would be 110 times 325 plus 80 times 9, right? And we get, I'll do it out here. I'm going to use a calculator. So we'll see what happens. $110 times 3.25 plus 80 times 9. That gives us 1,077.5, right? Okay. And see what the answer is here. Looks pretty close, right? Like I think I got it right in the middle of that error band. Okay, so this is kind of a question, we haven't seen one like this before, question 10. If the cost of a market basket in 2000 is 200 in year 1 and 230 in year 2, what is the price index in year 2? So this is something that what you want to do is you want to adjust things in terms of 100. So what we're going to say is 200 over 100. This is the cost. This is the index value in year 1. We want that to be equal to 230 over x, right? So we basically want to say if we think about 200 as 100, what is 230 then in terms of 100, right? So you can see here this will be 200x is equal to 23000, cross multiplying. X is going to be equal to, I was about to say that, 115, right. So that would be the answer, that's the base year. If you use the base year of 100, that is the value in terms of the typical index. So, people not most people, right? It seemed like everybody's right there in the middle of the error band. The inflation or deflation rate is the change in a price index divided by the average value of the price index. The change divided by the new number, the difference between the initial price index and the new, dividing the old by the new. No, so A is the closest, but there's something very weird about this, and it came up in the question earlier about why a rate of change was calculated. Turned out a little funny in this example, and I'm going to explain this to you. This will be my one thing I take a little bit of extra time to do here. So it should be A. And you'll notice I have this crazy little explanation down here. And I'm going to talk about this for 1 second, just because, I can. So I think this is this the question that you brought up before about it not? Look at the table. The rate of inflation in year 5. Okay. So the way I would have you do this question is the rate of inflation in year 5 should be the year-over-year change in prices, right? So what I would have in mind for question 12 is that you would do 150 minus 125 divided by 125, and that gives you 25 over 125, which is 0.2, right? 5 over, yeah. So this should be 0.2 or 20%. But if you actually if we look at the answer, we have something funny here, right? So the correct answer, it seems like it's just, hovering right against the 20% here. And it looks like most people landed in there, but some people came out. Now, if you look at this previous answer, when I have more time, I often teach people a different way to calculate growth rates, right? And so instead of doing it this way, I mean, in this class, and for us, this is fine. This is what we're doing. New value minus old value divided by old. But oftentimes, people calculate these growth rates by using new value minus old value divided by the average of new and old, right? And this would give us something like 25 over 137.5, right? So sometimes you'll see this. I'll just throw that out there. Why? Do anybody want to guess why you would do this? So this is because growth rates are reference dependent. And you can get weird answers if you sort of think of going forwards or backwards. So for example, let's suppose we start with a value of 50 and go to a value of 100. Right? It could be prices, could be anything. What is the growth rate here of the variable? Well, we would say it would be 100 minus 50 divided by 50, right? Which gives us 100%, right? What if, however, we thought about going from 100 to 50? We flipped the numbers. What is the growth rate here? Well, let's see here. We're going to change the sign because it's reduction, but we would have 50 minus 100 over 100, right? Which gives us negative 50%, right? 50 divided by 100. So some people find this distasteful, that when you're going backwards you get a drastically different answer than when you're going forwards. And so as a correction, you can use the average of the two numbers in the denominator. You see? So, long story short, I often, in past classes, I've talked about that, and then I was like, you know what? It's a lot of effort to spend on kind of a nuance that isn't all that important for what we're doing. So that's why this is an old question, and I think you asked about that, right, earlier in the why you might get the wrong answer. Yeah?
The formulas won't be provided for a check.
No, see, that was the other problem. It's like, just use V2 minus V1 divided by V1. It's one of these things that the more time you teach, the more you sort of realize that the idea of the growth rate is more important than getting the nuances all figured out. You can do that at a later period in time. So, yeah, just what we've been doing here. But it was fun to talk about for 3 minutes, I guess. Okay, the approximate rate of inflation in year 2. Well, of course, this is just 100 minus, there's a lot of calculations here. In this case, it's just 100 minus 80 divided by 80. So that would give you 1 over 4, right, or 0.25, or 25%, right? Now, in this case, it might be a little different if I use the average formula, but it's still, we're still within the error band there, and everybody basically kind of had that right.
Question 14, how do you do that? I don't understand.
Okay, so this is one where I probably used this in figuring out the answer. I probably used the average in the denominator, and that'll give you, and I didn't make the, so I tried to make the sort of error band large enough, but we'll see here what.
So it doesn't work when you do it the other way. Why is that?
Let's just test it out. It might just be that I didn't set the band for acceptable answers large enough, because it gives you the opportunity to set a band here. Okay, so what we want to do in this example is something like 82.4 minus 72.6 divided by 72.6. And does anybody, if they have a calculator handy, I'd never ask you to do this on the exam, so just kind of think about the spirit of the calculation here, rather than the,
That's 0.13.
0.134. Okay, so 13.4. Now, the more complex way of doing this, and I can do this quickly on my calculator, or I'm going to do it on ChatGPT, actually. We'll see if that'll add some excitement. Do this calculation out and see what we get there. All right, we'll see if ChatGPT knows how to do this. Yes, could you calculate the growth rate between 82. Could you calculate the growth rate from 72.6 to 82.4 using the midpoint formula? Okay. It gives me 12.65 as the answer in that case. So if I calculate this out, I get 0.126. Did I say 12.65? 0.127, right? Something like that. So let's see what I had here as my answer. So look what I did here. Not only did I not put in an error band, I put in this answer, 12.65, using this midpoint formula, instead of the 13.4, which is the right answer, at least in the way we've been kind of doing it this time.
One person got that right.
That's interesting. Yeah, you're right. Huh. Someone, maybe it wasn't really clear how to, maybe they looked at the previous answer and how I instructed to calculate growth rates the hard way. So, okay, moving on. Now that we had a growth rate controversy here, I guess we can leave that behind us. The key measure used to track economic growth, well, we talked about it, it's real GDP per capita, right? What we can create per person is really what we care about. And okay, some real GDP is a good answer, but not the best one. Okay, suppose a panel of economists predicts that a nation's GDP per capita will grow at 2%. According to the rule of 70, how many years will it take to double? Well, it should take about 35 years, right? So I guess I didn't really need to put an error band around that, and almost everybody got it right. On a small island, 40 people have jobs, 10 people are not working but looking, and 30 people are neither working nor looking for work. So this question sort of clues you into that those 30 are out of the labor force. And so the unemployment rate here would be 10 divided by 50, right? The whole labor force here is the 40 people who have jobs and the 10 people who don't. So 10 divided by 50 is 20%. Okay. And almost everybody got that right. Good. People who are moving between jobs, frictional unemployment. So we have frictional. A lot of people wrote that, but in bold. So that's one. I guess Top Hat can't handle that. Cyclical, no, that would be right. Economic frictional. Somebody wrote frictonal. Frictional unemployment is kind of a double word there. I used to get at least one person who would write fictional, right? So that didn't happen this time. The natural rate of unemployment is not the rate during recessions. It's not frictional and cyclical, but C, frictional and structural unemployment together, right? By the way, there's a big literature out there on changes in the level of the natural rate over time. It was for a long time supposed that it was going up because jobs were becoming more specialized. But now we think it's going down because it's just so easy to get online and find a job. The slump in the 70s looked different from the slump at the beginning of the Great Depression because it was largely caused by events in the Middle East, right, that led to a supply shock, as we now call it, and soaring costs of oil. And so almost well, not everybody, but we didn't talk a lot about that historical episode, but that was the idea. When the aggregate price level blanks, the quantity of aggregate output blanks, right? So price level goes up, aggregate demand should go up. Okay, that one's not there. So B looks like the best answer. At lower aggregate price levels, aggregate output, right, falls. Oh, I'm sorry. This is aggregate demand. Higher prices, lower demand. Geez, A. Oh. Oops. Yeah. C. I don't know what just happened to me there. I think I'll be okay, but yeah, that's it's demand. When the price level rises, people demand less aggregate output. Maybe it's because I'm trying to speed up here a little bit. Government spending on healthcare is likely to shift the blank curve to the blank. Well, that's an increase in spending like anything else, so it should shift aggregate demand to the right or out. Right? I would prefer to say out. I think it's more descriptive, so that's right. And there we go there. The short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward because a higher aggregate price level leads to higher output, I would think, right? Since most production costs are fixed in the short run. So B is a good answer there, is the best. And almost everybody got that right. Good work. So why would aggregate supply fall, right? Or increase aggregate supply? I don't quite like this because what we really mean is a shift out in aggregate supply. So a large decrease in the price of oil is probably the best one because that means that the price of an important input has gone down, shifting supply out, right? So I will just leave it like that. The long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical, right? That's because, why is that once again in the case? Well, you'll learn more about it in your higher level macro classes, but the idea is that in the long run, it's really, it's really our technology, our people, what they can do, and the price level is irrelevant, right, over long periods of time. In fact, you don't even have to think about what the currency is, you just sort of say, what can we do as a society here? Potential output is the level of real GDP that occurs, this is a tough one, occurs when the actual rate of unemployment is zero. That's not it. Not when it only has cyclical unemployment. B is kind of the best answer, right? The supposition is that when all the prices are free to adjust as they will, we'll wind up at long-run aggregate supply or at potential. This is something we didn't talk about in great detail, yet most of you were able to get it right. I don't think I would ask a question like that on the exam. So we're almost there. We're getting close to the end here, and I think I'll make it. Okay, if the economy is at point E, you'll notice that we're above potential, so this should be an inflationary gap. Here the question's a little simpler. It just says if we're at point E, actual output is more than potential output, right? So that would be B here. B. You guys, those of you who did the practice exam did quite well. Okay, so this is a tougher question. I kind of like this question. It's in the spirit of my think about what happens, a chain of events. If the economy is at point E, we would say that nominal wages will blank. I would just say wages. We weren't too clear about that, precise vocabulary. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift blank until actual output is at potential output, right? So think about what happens here in this inflationary gap. I kind of hurried here so I would have enough time to draw the picture and kind of say this one more time to you. So what we want to do is think about the rest of this diagram. If we filled in everything, this point E is something like this. Here's aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Here's long-run aggregate supply or potential, Q and P. Now, what we think of as happening is if we just sort of leave the economy to its own devices, everybody's working, labor markets are tight, firms want to produce more, they're going to have to pay more. This pressure, right, the fact that unemployment is below its natural rate means that wages will start creeping up and aggregate supply over time adjusts like this, right? So this is why people often say, why we call this an inflationary gap. Because in the end, what's going to happen is the party's going to end, and prices, and what's going to cause this? It's going to be rising wages and prices. So inflation. So let's see, we would expect nominal wages to increase, aggregate supply to shift left until we're back at potential, so that's A. Yeah, good work. That's a hard question. I mean, that's kind of macroeconomics in a nutshell, is being able to kind of string together a set of different, this causes that, and then that causes the next thing, so on and so forth. Okay, so now we come back to Earth a little bit. Look at the figure. At F, potential output is greater than actual output, right? Higher than actual output, and unemployment is high. So that should be C. What? No, so that's not the right answer. And see, look at that. I think what happened was just, my answer key is wrong because of pure semantic confusion, right? Potential output is greater than actual output. You usually think about actual output in its relation to potential. So I think what just happened is I misread the question, and I thought it was actual output is less than potential output, because that's usually how you phrase things. It's kind of reversed, but as written, this is right. Suffice it to say, I would want to avoid such semantic difficulties on an exam. What are these curves here? All right, well, 1 we would think about as aggregate demand, 2 should be long-run aggregate supply, and 3 should be short-run aggregate supply, right? If you wanted to label them like that. We didn't always label them exactly like that, but that's the idea, and almost everybody did pretty well on that. Okay. Over time, in the long run, as the economy self-corrects, a decrease in aggregate demand will cause the price level to blank in potential. This is very subtle, and will cause the price level to do what and potential output to do what. So it says in the long run. That's a little tricky, because essentially what we're saying is, suppose we're in the long run, that would kind of mean this is why I'm not in love with this question, because it's not completely specified. But here's aggregate supply, here's aggregate demand. What the question has in mind is, okay, so aggregate demand decreases, but in the long run, what happens is aggregate supply adjusts. And once again, we talked about how this is kind of the natural cycle of the economy around potential. Sort of dips below and then goes back. So you can see here the best answer would be that the price level falls and potential output remains stable. So I'm going to say D is probably the best, because in the short run, it's true that output would fall, but in the long run, we should get back to potential. So very subtle and very well done by you. I think this is my last one, right? Oh, no. Not a tool of fiscal policy. Which one? Well, fiscal policy is taxing and spending, so D is the odd man out. People got that right? Okay, so here we are. We're in an inflationary gap here, right? So what would be a good fiscal policy? Anything that would decrease aggregate demand, right? Remember, lean against the wind. When spending is too high, spend less. So a decrease in transfer payments, that's things like unemployment insurance, would help, right? More government spending would be bad. Cutting taxes would be bad. Both of those things would further shift aggregate demand out, as would D. So really A is the only suitable answer. Tough question for people there. Boy, how many questions are there? I don't know if I'm going to... Oh boy, it's 9:45. I guess if you want to leave, you can. And maybe I can just kind of go through and I'll name out the answer. I'll yell out the answers here. Okay, this is an inflationary gap, right, in this question. Okay, AD1 will shift to the blank, causing a increase and an increase. So this should be C. Finally, the last one. We're at E2. This would be AD2 will shift to the left, causing a decrease and a decrease. So A2 left decrease decrease is B. And there, I did it. Now I'm done.